Hi everyone, welcome to the iSpring Solutions webinar series, where every week we talk about e-learning trends, share iSpring tips and tricks, and cover clients' cases. I am Paulina, a community manager at iSpring, and I will be the moderator for today's session, where we will talk about e-learning accessibility, a super important topic that I think everyone should know about. And our today's presenter will be busting the top 10 myths for you. And speaking of our today's presenter, that's Susi Miller, founder and director of Ella Hub. Hi, Susie.
Hi
How are you
there.
doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. All right, I think at this moment we are more than ready to begin. So, Susan, I'm happy to pass the mic over to you as well as the
Okay,
presenter rights.
fantastic. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much to Paulina and to iSpring for inviting me today. And also I wanted to start by thanking everyone here for really giving up your valuable time to find out more about e-learning accessibility. So what we're going to do first of all is have a look at the agenda of what we're going to cover in the session. So we're going to start by having a look at what we actually mean by accessibility to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I think that accessibility can have lots of different meanings in an e-learning context. So that's why I always just make sure that everyone understands what we mean by accessibility before we start. And next, I'll go through the 10 most common myths about e-learning accessibility. And I'll also be giving you a few useful takeaways as we go through. So hopefully you'll find that helpful if you are needing to maybe advocate for inclusive learning content in your work or when you're working. So then we'll have a final key takeaway before we move on. And to finish, we'll also have some time for a Q&A session. So probably we'll answer most of the Q&A in the session at the end. Before we start, I just wanted to say as well that I have created some support notes for the presentation, and that really contains all of the points that I'll be covering on the session today, and it also has some useful links. So if you wanted to find out more about e-learning accessibility, then hopefully that will be a useful resource. And Polina has very kindly agreed to share the notes with you sometime during the talk, so she'll be posting them up for you. So just to make you aware that that everything I cover will be in those notes that you can have a look at when I've finished. Okay, so we said we were going to start by having a look at what accessibility meant. So we'll start with a definition of accessibility. And I often find that when I use the term accessibility in an e-learning context, a lot of people misunderstand me and they think that I'm talking about, they're using accessibility in the sense of something that you can easily get or easily attain, or something that is easy to understand or appreciate. And although I think it can have have those meanings, it definitely does. For the purposes of this presentation, what we mean by accessibility, I think, is best defined by W3C, and that's the World Wide Web Consortium. And they say that accessibility means that people with disabilities can equally perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with content. And it also means that they can contribute equally without barriers. And I think that one of the key words to be aware of in this definition really is barriers, because unless we develop learning which is accessible, what we're doing actually is preventing people from achieving their full potential. So if we create barriers in learning by not making it accessible, what we're doing is limiting people's ability to learn and therefore succeed in our education system, in the workplace, and ultimately even in our society. So while I think that many people are aware of the barriers we can create in our actual learning content, so for example, things like not adding alternative text to images or captions to videos, for me, it's almost more important to be aware of the many barriers which stop designers and developers engaging with accessibility in the first place. And these, I think, are the many myths, the assumptions, the misconceptions, which I think are still surprisingly common today. So what we'll do is we'll have a go at tackling 10 of the most common of these now, and hopefully by the end of the session, I'll be able to persuade even the most convinced skeptics that creating accessible learning content is without a doubt the right thing to do, and it's also achievable for everyone. So we'll start now by looking in more depth at these myths, and really they're just based on the most common things which I hear from clients at conferences, in discussions, or that I see on social media. Now, throughout the session today, I'm going to be asking you some questions, and there's no need to put your answers in the chat, but I really just want to get you thinking. So I'll be asking you questions throughout the session. So, the first thing I'm going to ask you is to try and guess what you think is the most common myth which prevents e learning professionals from engaging with accessibility, just to see if you've had the same experience as I have. So, just a second or two to have a think. So, in my experience, the myth that I probably hear or encounter most often is that accessibility isn't worth doing because it only benefits a niche audience. Now, if you do any research into statistics about disability in different countries, you'll probably find a wide range of different information. And this can be due to the definitions of disability used or the way that the data is collected or interpreted. And that's why I tend to stick to the broad range of statistics which are offered by accessibility experts. And they say that in most Western countries, the size of the disabled population ranges from 12% to 26% of the overall population. And globally, most people seem to agree that it's about 15%. So, having said that, the statistics in the US are actually very clear. According to the CDC, 61 million adults, or 26% of the population, have some type of disability. So, while those statistics alone might not be enough to persuade everyone of the importance of accessibility, I think sometimes the economics behind those figures helps. So, the spending power of households with at least one disabled person is estimated to be $490 billion in the US and $8 trillion worldwide. And this brings us on to our first key takeaway of the session, which comes from Neil Milliken, and he is a global head of accessibility at Atos. And it's the best counter argument that I've heard to this myth. And what he says is that 1.3 billion disabled people worldwide is not a niche, it's a demographic megatrend. So I hope you'll agree that's a great quote to have to hand whenever anyone suggests that disabled people are a niche audience in our learning. So, our next myth is the one where people say things like, we don't need to make learning accessible because we don't have any disabled people in our workforce, or it could equally be students in our institution. But since so much of what we do does focus on the workplace learning, we'll have a go at addressing this one in the workforce. So, this brings us to our next question. And again, no need to answer in the chat, just have a guess yourself. What percentage of the US workforce is disabled? So is it 8%, 12%, or 15%? Can just a pause so you can have a think. So I actually found it quite difficult to get accurate up-to-date figures, but an accepted approximation is about 12%. In the UK, it was actually easier to get statistics, and it's about 13%. So I think you'd agree that 12 to 13% is a pretty significant percentage of our audience to exclude from our workplace learning content if we don't make it accessible. But another key thing to be aware of is that it's likely that these figures are a significant underestimate, and that is due to two things really: undisclosed and undiagnosed disability. So, a recent study in the US concluded that only about 39% of employees with disabilities have disclosed this to their manager and about 21% to HR. So, if you add to this the large numbers of people who have not had a formal diagnosis, and that can often apply to people who have neurodiverse conditions such as dyslexia or ADHD, then your percentage goes up even further. And the final factor to be aware of when it comes to workplace disability is that whether through things such as depression, chronic stress, cancer, or back pain, some workers become disabled at work. In fact, according to Microlink, 1 in 4 people who become disabled do so whilst they are in work. So, although we can't be sure of the exact figures, I think it's safe to say that making our workplace learning inaccessible excludes more than, I think we can say, 1 in 10 of our audience. Is that really what we want for our compulsory compliance training, our health and safety courses, or our staff development programs? So, our next myth is about the range of disabilities which are catered for by accessible learning content. And a misconception that I've encountered many times is that accessibility is only important for people with visual impairments. And I think this is a really important one to tackle because without having an understanding of the range of disabilities which are covered by accessibility, it's impossible, I think, to understand the types of things that we need to do to make our learning accessible. So, to tackle this myth, we'll start by looking at the 4 categories, which for ease, we divide digital accessibility into. And these are vision, hearing, motor, and cognitive. And these are, of course, very artificially neat categories, but for our purposes, I think it's a really useful starting point. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to start thinking again. But before I do that, I just want you to focus on the icon that we have for motor impairments. So it's really important to be aware that in the digital context, when we're talking about motor impairments, we're thinking about dexterity issues. And those are things which make it difficult or sometimes impossible for learners to interact with content using a mouse. And instead, they use a range of different assistive technologies, but very often it is a keyboard. So hopefully that will be helpful now that we move on to our next task that I'm going to ask you to do. So what I'd like you to do now is to see if you can think of a person who has a disability or an impairment. It could be yourself, it could be a colleague, a customer, it could be a client, it could be a friend, it could be a family member, or it could even be someone famous. Now I want you to think of which of the 4 categories their disability or impairment would fall under for our digital purposes. So if they were interacting with digital content, what would we need to be aware of? Which of these 4 categories would they fit into? And now I'm going to ask you to see if you can think of one example for each of the other categories. So again, just pause for a second. You don't have to put anything in the chat. Just want you to have a think yourself. Okay, so what we'll do now is I'll just run through some of the examples of things that people have given me in the past. So if we start off with vision, very often we have blindness comes up. Color blindness is also one to be aware of. Low vision, and then we have some specific examples here. We have glaucoma, cataracts. I've also had diabetic retinopathy has also come up as an example. Under hearing, we often have deafness comes up, hearing loss, we have acoustic trauma, and again, some specific examples here, auditory processing disorder. And then when we think of our motor impairments, thinking of dexterity and what might affect someone interacting with the content and not being able to use a mouse. Quite often we have loss or damage of limbs comes up. We have examples such as arthritis, multiple sclerosis, RSI, repetitive strain injury, cerebral palsy, and Parkinson's comes up very often. And then under cognitive, this is probably the widest sort of group that we have. It covers so many different aspects, really, of cognitive ability. So we have some learning disabilities, so quite often Down syndrome will come up. Then we have some examples of neurodiversity, so things like dyslexia, ADHD, ASD. And then we have some of the conditions that are affected by movement. So we have and flashing. So we have epilepsy, vestibular disorder that comes up, and then also mental health issues as well is another thing that is really important to be aware of when you're considering cognitive differences when you're looking at your e-learning content. So I hope that's a great start in helping you to be more aware of the different types of disabilities and the impairments which benefit from accessible learning, and for tackling this myth, which is really common in our industry, I think, that accessibility is only really for people who have visual impairments. And quite often people are very focused on people who use screen readers. So we're trying to move away from that misconception really and look at the broader picture. So now that we've discovered the different types of disability and who it benefits, it's time to tackle an associated myth, really. And that is the one that says accessibility only benefits learners with permanent disabilities. And although some disabled people find it understandably frustrating that accessibility needs to be justified by widening the scope to temporary and situational impairments, I do think it's valuable to consider because it changes the focus away from the kind of us versus them thinking. And instead, it just shifts it to just us thinking. This actually affects everybody. So, the idea, in other words, that accessibility benefits everyone. So to look at this in closer detail, we're going to start with temporary impairments. And again, I want you to have a few seconds just to think about some impairments that people could have temporarily, which might make it difficult or impossible to interact with digital learning content. Okay, so have a think about that. Okay, so the picture on the screen, I think, might give you a clue as to a motor impairment. So we have a motor impairment due to an injured hand or wrist. We could also have a visual impairment due to eye surgery, a hearing impairment due to a head cold, a cognitive impairment due to stress and anxiety. So all of these things are things which can affect all of us at any time. And now we'll move on to situational impairments. And interestingly, when I used to cover this topic on training, people often found it quite difficult to think of what situations could affect their ability to interact with digital content or digital learning. But I found that it's much easier for most people now to think of some situational impairments after the impact of COVID and people working from home. So if we look at our next example, again, have a think about some of the things that might affect your ability to interact with content at home or any situation really. And again, we've got an example on the screen of a picture of someone, which is for, again, this is for a motor impairment. So someone using a laptop whilst holding a sleeping child. But we could also have visual impairment using old equipment or a slow broadband, which won't allow you to download images, so you can't see the images in the learning. For hearing impairment, we could have someone sharing a kitchen table with someone on a Zoom call, certainly something that I've had experience of. And for cognitive impairment, we could have learning in a noisy and distracting home environment. So I think considering temporary and situational impairments is a really useful strategy in showing how accessibility can benefit all of our learners. And it isn't just all the time focused on people who have permanent disability. It will benefit a range of different situations and a range of different learners. So, nearly halfway there now. Our next myth is the one which says that accessibility is only important for federal departments and agencies. Now, it's true that due to legislation such as Section 508, accessibility is more important in federal organisations at the moment, but it's also worth knowing that according to 3Play Media, it's also extended to other types of organisations through things like state laws, institutional laws, and grant requirements. And it's also worth knowing that even though you may think that accessibility is only important for federal agencies, your competitors don't agree with you. So we have two quotes now from the industry perspectives, which come from the book I've written called Designing Accessible Learning Content. And the first is from a leading content provider, and they say that there is a noticeable increase in awareness in accessibility in procurement procedures across the board, with many potential customers now actively seeking out information about our accessibility credentials. And the second is from an authoring tool provider, and they say that although inclusive design may have been overlooked in the past, it is now so fundamental to the diversity and inclusion agenda of so many organizations that providing learning content which is not accessible to all learners is simply no longer an option. So I think both of those are really significant comments, points of view to be aware of. And I think it also a kind of a flavour of things are beginning to change when it comes to accessibility. So, continuing our focus on authoring tools, I think it's becoming increasingly common to see many of them focusing on the accessibility features of their tools because they recognize that it's good for business and for extending their market research. And I've also recently seen evidence of accessibility being a unique selling point for learning management systems and also virtual events platforms. So, the key takeaway really is that your competitors have already realized that making their products and services accessible enhances their brand and increases their market share and profits. And that is far beyond a focus on government agencies only. So now the next myth that we're going to tackle shifts us to thinking more about the e-learning content itself. And this is one that goes something like, you can't use images or videos in accessible e-learning. And I think this myth has mainly come about because of our reliance for many years as an industry on providing an accessible alternative for our e-learning courses. So in most cases, this was a Word or a PDF document, which typically contained only the text of the course, and it was designed to be an alternative for people who used assistive technology, and most often it was screen reader users that were the main target audience. Now, a couple of years ago at a learning technologies conference in the UK, there was a talk that I attended from the people from the Nobly authoring tool, as it was called then, and I discovered a really useful visual way of demonstrating the result of this approach that we've had to this kind of what we do with learning. So the first image we have is of a standard Rubik's Cube, and it has all of the squares in the bright colors that we're familiar with. And that represents a standard e-learning course not designed for accessibility. And our second image shows the accessible alternative. Now it's been adapted so that each of the squares has its color indicated instead of with the color, but it's indicated instead in Braille. So that is so that it's accessible for a non-visual learner. But the crucial point here is that all of the squares are now white, and that makes it a really poor experience for someone who is a visual learner. And that's exactly what happens when we strip out any visual engagement or video content from our courses, because we think we need to do that in order to make them accessible. But it doesn't have to be that way. So we can use as many images as we like, as long as we follow two simple rules. And those are, if we use images which add meaning to our resource, we just need to make sure that we add alternative text, which can be read out by screen readers, which describe the importance or the important meaning of the image that we've used. And any images which we add that are only used for decoration, we mark them in whatever way our authoring tool allows us, so they're not recognized by voice screen readers and they're not being read out when actually they add nothing at all to the learning experience. So things can get a bit more complex when we go into more depth about providing good alternative text, but those I think are the two basic principles, and they allow us to use images in e-learning content and make them accessible for everyone. And we have similar devices that we can add to video resources to make them accessible. So we need to add captions to our videos so that they're accessible for people who have hearing impairments, and also very useful for people who have cognitive impairments as well. And again, coming back to different, being helpful for everyone. They're also very useful for people whose first language is not English. Find it quite useful to have captions as well often. And again, doing that, how you do that depends on the functionality of the authoring tool. But some tools do have a captioning tool, and others, many of them allow you to upload a video which has captions. So a really important thing if you are using the option to upload videos which already have captions in them. So for example, quite often people use videos which have captions added in YouTube. One really important thing for us to be aware of is that those captions always need to be edited to correct any errors and to always add punctuation. So really important point if you're using automatic captions. So if your videos contain important visual content, it's also important that you add audio description or a transcript which describes this for learners with visual impairment. So a little bit like our alternative text, but the idea is to do that also for any videos that have important visual content. And so here is the key takeaway of this myth, really. And we'll come back to our Rubik's Cube image or an analogy here. So making e-learning content accessible doesn't harm the learning experience. What it does is it enhances the experience for everyone. So it adds alternative ways of accessing the content, which caters for a whole different range of experiences and preferences. And in other words, it provides multiple ways of accessing the content which can suit different learners. So just like a Rubik's Cube, which has color and texture that we can see, it caters for a wider audience and it provides a richer learning experience for everyone. So let's focus now a bit more on some of the myths which surround the nuts and the bolts of actually creating accessible learning content. So coming back to our experience as instructional designers and developers. Myth number 7 is a common complaint I hear from designers and developers. And what it is it says that we can't make our e-learning accessible because we don't have the right authoring tool. So what we're going to do now is explore some of the ways that authoring tools can make it easier for us to create accessible learning content. And we'll start with a true or false question for you to have a think about. So there are guidelines to help providers make their authoring tools accessible. Do you think that's true or false? Okay, so the answer is true. You may be surprised to find out that there are actually accessibility guidelines to help providers make their authoring tools accessible and also make the content they produce accessible. So they're produced by the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, which we talked about earlier. And it's the same organization which is responsible for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or we call them WCAG quite often for short. And the guidelines we're talking about for the authoring tools are known as the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines, or ATAG, and they were first released in 2015. But unlike WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, these guidelines, they're not a legal obligation in any country. But ATAG does have a whole series of detailed recommendations that are really helpful. At its heart, its aim is to make tools themselves accessible for developers and to make sure that tools allow developers to create accessible content. And it also one of the important things, one of the most important things I think is for us designers and developers, is that it supports us to make that content accessible. So it helps us to find out how we can do it. So the ATAG then give us the benchmark to what authoring tool providers should be doing or could be doing to make it easier for us to produce accessible learning content. Now, for the research that I did on my book, I assessed a lot of authoring tools. I don't think that there is one particular one that is doing everything absolutely right, but I think the really important thing to be aware of is that they are getting better and accessibility is definitely becoming more on the agenda. But there is still, if we come back to our Rubik's Cube analogy, there is sometimes that it sometimes does still feel a little bit awkward and it can feel a bit time consuming. So in my analogy for the Rubik's Cube, I have this image here of someone who's trying to apply the texture to the Rubik's Cube, which we said was important to make it an inclusive experience for everyone. Sometimes it can feel a bit time consuming, a bit like applying a glue gun to get your texture on. And sometimes it can even feel, even more difficult, sometimes a little bit cumbersome, like even if you have to stick pins in your Rubik's Cube, a little bit, as sometimes accessibility feels when you're a developer and you're trying to apply it to the learning that you're creating. So what we'll do now is we'll have a look at some of the things that e-learning tool providers do and they can do to make it easier for us to create accessible learning content. So the first one that I think is really helpful is if there is what we call an up-to-date conformance or a conformance statement or a VPAT, a voluntary product accessibility template. And the ideal version of this is important for us developers and designers is that it shows how the tool is meeting the standards of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And the current version, which is the most widely used in basically in legal terms, is level 2.1, version 2.1, level A and double A. So that is the one that I say that it's the most common level of conformance needed by the majority of international legislation. So that is really helpful if you have a conformance statement or something that tells you which of these standards that the tool is able to meet. And best practice examples also have specific guidelines to show you how you can use your tool to meet those to meet those different standards. Another best practice is to provide good additional supporting guidance that gives you more information about making your content accessible. And the example that I have on the screen gives you more details, gives more details about the tool that's used there, about the different layouts that can be used to accommodate different types of access needs. So the example that we have here is which layouts are best for someone, for example, who has dyslexia. So really helpful information. Another best practice, you may be aware of this example, is a best practice feature is to have accessible alternatives. So you could have an ordering drop down activity instead of an ordering drag and drop activity, which is really helpful to make sure that your content is interactive but is also accessible. Accessibility checkers are another great feature. We're quite used to them in our Office applications in PowerPoint, for example, and Word documents, but it's also possible. Some tools provide them in the e-learning authoring tool. It's very helpful. Um, Clearly labeled WCAG compliant themes. So if you have themes that have been created and they meet all of the conditions that you need for the web content accessibility guidelines, that's really useful to know. And a final example is to have accessibility built in the workflow. So if you've got some information about what you should be doing as you're designing, that's really helpful if it's telling you about accessibility as you're going along, because then it doesn't feel like we were coming back to our, sticking pins in the Rubik's cube. It feels more like that it's just part of your workflow, just part of your everyday work, and it's not an additional chore or something else that you have to do. So I hope you agree that there are some really great examples out there of best practice accessibility tools amongst a whole range of different tools. And I think a lot of these, as I say, are already available. And I really hope that they become standard in every tool moving forward, because it really helps us as developers and as designers to create accessible learning content. So now moving on to our next myth. This is the one that says accessible learning can't be engaging or interactive. And I think this one is very similar to our myth about accessible e-learning not being able to be visually engaging. And it falls into the category of what I call sort of the either or dilemma. And this is the idea that e-learning can either be engaging or it can be accessible. It can either be interactive or it can be accessible. It can be innovative or accessible. It can be beautifully designed or accessible. So you get the idea. So I actually think that this misconception is probably the single most damaging to the reputation of accessible e-learning that we have. And I think it is the reason why so many e-learning professionals don't engage with accessibility. So we'll start our exploration of this myth just with one final question for you to think about. Do you know which interactivity in your authoring tool is accessible? So that's either yes or no. And of course, there's no right or wrong answer to this question, but it's worth knowing that many tools now offer interactive activities which are accessible. So again, we have another example of a different authoring tool here. This is a good example from an authoring tool which offers an overview information, and it's all in one handy place. It's all a list which tells you which content is accessible and not accessible. So for me, that's again another best practice that helps you to know what you can use that is accessible and what you should be avoiding. And then other tools may not have such an easy to access list, but they certainly have interactive activities which are accessible. And we'll come back to our iSpring example here of an ordering drop down activity instead of an ordering drag and drop activity. So the first one isn't accessible for people who use screen readers or navigate using a keyboard, but the alternative is. So other e-learning interactivity, which is commonly accessible, includes true or false questions. They are very often can be used with a keyboard and screen readers, multiple choice and multiple response activities. So if the tool that you're using has interactivity, which is accessible, and that also provides the opportunity for content authors to be creative and innovative. So, if authoring tools are getting much better at accessibility, is there something else which is still holding it back from becoming the default in the learning content that we create? And I'd say the last two of our myths are a big part of the reason for this. And the first of these, number 9 in our list, is that we don't have the time or the budget to make e learning accessible. Now, while I think it's really important to be clear that accessibility does take commitment and it does take extra time, particularly when people are new to it, there are actually many strategies which can help organizations to make accessibility less time consuming and less costly. So we don't have time to go into them in great detail now, but we'll have a look at some of the key ones. So I'll just run through them. The most important of these strategies, I think, is to make sure that accessibility is a consideration or a requirement from the start of a project. If anyone has been involved in kind of retrofitting or shoehorning in accessibility at the end of a project, you will know it's infinitely more time consuming and costly to do it this way. So really, really beneficial to be aware of accessibility upfront. Other things you can consider to streamline the accessibility process are to be confident from the outset about the accessibility capability of your tool and also how to work around any limitations. So that may mean that you might need to avoid certain activities, interactivity as we've talked about. It may mean that you need to provide an accessibility statement which gives alternatives to people, or it may be that you in that accessibility statement you know have a list of things that actually are not able to be accessible with that particular the tool that you're using. So I'd also advise people to set up accessibility templates or accessible templates and interactions which can be reused in projects. So that's a real time saver. And other things which are key are having organizational support. So, leadership, which recognizes the benefits of accessibility and is supportive of the extra time and the resources that it will take to implement, particularly at the beginning, as I said, for that initial training and support for content authors. Developing a team of champions is also a very helpful strategy, and what that does is it prevents accessibility from just being the kind of the speciality of one or two passionate individuals, which can often be the case in organizations. So that's a very quick whiz through some of the things that you could consider doing. But to finish this myth, I just want to share a comment that I saw recently on social media. And it really was a true light bulb for me when I read this comment. So, what they said was that accessibility isn't more work. You were just cutting corners before. Your work was incomplete. So, a key takeaway from me there. Okay, and now we are moving on to our final myth, and another reason that I believe so many e learning designers and developers fail to engage with accessibility. And this is the idea that we can't make e learning accessible because it's too difficult. And here's the thing about this myth really. If you're talking about, sorry, just go back to the other one. If you're talking about making content generally accessible, then this is something that I think is achievable in many, I think often quite simple ways. But if you're talking about making your learning content accessible for legal regulations, and as we mentioned, that's most often WCAG 2.1 level A and AA, then I would have to agree that this does often seem true. So just to look at one of the most I would say notorious of the WCAG success criteria, it's called WCAG 1.3.1, and it's labeled info and relationships, and I think it's a good demonstration of why people do think that accessibility is very difficult. What this standard says is that information, structure, and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. Now, the main purpose of this standard is to make sure that content authors that we use headings and we use list styles, and we also mark header rows on tables so that they're accessible for assistive technology users. But I don't think that it's very easy to get that meaning from that standard. I challenge anyone who said that this explanation is clear and easy to understand. So the language that's used here is technical and complicated, and it's also designed for web developers. So that's the key thing about the web content accessibility guidelines, is that they were written for web developers. So I think it makes it very difficult for the majority of e-learning professionals to understand. And I think that leads to far too many people just giving up on accessibility altogether. And the language that we have in that example is quite typical of the language that you'll find in WCAG, in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And that includes the four, what we call the overarching principles. And they are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And I believe that very few people understand the meaning of these. And certainly when I'm if I'm delivering training and I'm talking about these, I always have to refer back to my notes just to be clear on exactly what they mean and what they're referring to. So for me, that's not a very effective way of dividing them or of describing them, because it often makes it really difficult to find any information, and really time consuming and frustrating. So that frustration really led me to write the book that I was just talking about earlier, that designing accessible learning content. What I wanted to do was save as many instructional designers, content authors, developers from the hours and hours of grappling with accessibility and trying to apply the WCAG to learning content. I wanted to make it easier for everyone to do. So the book is based around a contextual framework, and that allows you to apply WCAG in a logical order, and it makes sense for designing learning content, and it translates all of those standards into plain English, and it gives lots of different examples using different authoring tools, so quite a few iSpring examples in the book. So you can see on the slide that you can get a 20% discount on the book if you order it from the publisher and use the code. And I've also included the links and the code in the supporting document, which, as I say, Paulina has very, very kindly agreed to share with you. So that concludes our look at the top 10 e-learning accessibility myths, and I hope that it has made it possible to see, I think, the huge benefits and value of accessible e-learning. And I genuinely believe that attitudes are slowly but surely changing in our industry, and that there is no longer really an excuse for us not to move forward as an industry and work towards making accessible learning content the norm rather than the exception. So I think it's the responsibility of everybody. I think it's the responsibility of leaders and also of us at grassroots level. Because if we just move on to our key takeaway, if you remember nothing at all else from this presentation, what I would like you to do is take away this key takeaway, this famous quote from the user experience guru Steve Krug. And he said, "The one argument for accessibility which doesn't get made nearly often enough is how extraordinarily better it makes some people's lives." How many opportunities do we have to dramatically improve people's lives just by doing our job a little better? Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. I'll just move on to my Q&A slide and then move Bear with me, just move over back here. So I don't know whether, Polina, you wanted to look at any of the questions that you were going to ask me in the Q&A session. If I stop sharing.
Yeah, let me come back.
Yeah, you're back.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
No problem.
Yeah, and sure, we're ready for the Q&A session. So if anybody has any other questions that you would like to address to Susie, that would be the best way, the best time to do that. Um, all right, so we do have a couple of. Okay, I would like to ask my colleague Nadia to share Susie's email address or all the information that people can use to get in touch.
Yeah, yeah, very welcome.
That would be wonderful. Perfect. Thank you so much, Nadia, for doing that. Um, So there is a question, I guess, from Simon. Can I make a plea for getting titles and other classifications details right? We need to help get people to the right training.
Okay. I'm not sure if that's an iSpring question or a general question.
Yes, Simon, we need your help.
Yeah.
And also, let's see if there were any other questions that we missed. Diane asked when you were talking about disabilities, what
Mhm.
about migraines?
Yeah, yeah, I would say, yeah, it's certainly a condition that would definitely affect, your ability to interact with digital content. So yeah, a really, really good example, and affects a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And Catherine says, thank you, and the book is really useful.
Oh, thank you. That's really kind.
All right. Let's see if we have any other questions coming. Not really a question, just having seen the world of bad LMS pages and search results, people can't learn from accessible training if they can't find it.
Very good point. Yeah, yeah. It's the whole package, really, isn't it? Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Hmm. And then Steve's comment is we employ a lot of persons new to the country and find that English as a second language is a barrier.
Uh-huh. So I think then, yeah, it's again thinking about the accessibility benefiting so many more people. So I think things like captions are really beneficial, and also transcripts, which I didn't talk about in the presentation, I think are key, for creating, if you're using video content, to have a transcript that people can use. I know a lot of people, yeah, as I say, who have English as second language, just find it useful to have that content in a different format. And also I think, I've certainly seen a lot of students using transcripts for things like study aids. So again, it's just thinking of how a transcript can benefit someone who has a hearing impairment, but it also has so many, so much wider, and sometimes just preference. People just prefer, I've certainly set people tasks on my training and asked them to watch a video, but also provided a transcript as well. And some people just say, well, and I've asked them which they've done. Some people have said, well, I used the transcript because I was, on a train journey and I didn't have my headphones with me. And then other people say, well, I just don't like watching videos. I just prefer reading. So it just it accommodates, people's different preferences, really, of how they consume the content. So really, again, beneficial to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that comment. And also, Mark says that can help. Sometimes it's hard to recreate the training multiple times in multiple languages, so transcripts can help at times.
Definitely.
All right. It looks like we've covered all questions that came in during the session itself and also some of the questions that were sent during the Q&A. Um, yeah, Sam was also asking, is this the death for drag and drop? I really like that quiz question type.
Okay, well, that's really interesting actually because I've seen a lot of people. I was just showing the kind of the do-it-yourself method that I created for drag and drop, and but I have seen in other, and I've spoken to other authoring tool providers, and they have created an accessible version, so it's not the exact same version of using your mouse to drag and drop something, but they have created an alternative. So that's where for me I think that accessibility, it comes back to that it actually can make people more innovative, because you think of, I wouldn't say it's the death of a drag and drop, because I think there are alternatives that are being created that do this the same idea, but maybe in a slightly different way. So yeah, good question.
That's good to know, says Sam. Yeah, Teresa, thanks for sharing. PowerPoint has a feature for subtitles in the different languages under the slideshow tab under subtitle settings.
It does, yeah, yeah, really helpful.
Okay, yeah, I think that's the great point for us to wrap up our today's session. I
Okay.
would like to thank everyone for coming today, for spending this hour with us, for investing that time in something that will
Mhm.
definitely suit you during your future content creation. And yeah, Susie, thank you so much for sharing with us this invaluable information. Yeah, um, we just have to keep this in mind when creating our content. So yeah, again,
Great,
thank you for
definitely.
coming,
You're
being our guest
welcome.
today.
A pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me.
Yeah, of course. And I would like to remind everybody to that I will be including all the information shared today, including the links and the handout in the follow-up message that you will receive tomorrow, as well as the recording of this session. So please, no worries if you missed some bits of the information, you will be able to review them afterwards. Okay, so at this point, I would like to thank everybody and just wish you a lovely day. Bye, everybody. Hope you have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Bye, Susie.
Bye bye. Thanks so much.